Welcome to Interface here on SABC2. My name is Thembi Samachele. Well, WITS University has avoided a showdown with the Student Representative Council. The two have reached an agreement regarding the funding of needy students. Earlier, the student organization was threatening more protests at WITS, and they were saying that if the institution fails to resolve the funding for needy students, there would be further problems. But what are some of the challenges that exist in providing funding in some of these universities, and how should government and the universities support needy students? These are some of the questions we're asking on Interface tonight. And joining me to discuss this is Professor HABIB, who is the Vice Chancellor at WITS University, and Dr. Di Parker, who is the Deputy Director General in the Department of Higher Education. Now, as you know, as usual, if you would like to participate in our conversation, you can do so via our social media pages. You can find us on Facebook, it's Interface on SABC2, or on Twitter at Thembi Samachele, or at Interface on SABC. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you.
So first question is, why is it every year we have the same funding crisis at most of the universities? I don't know if I should direct that to you, Prof, or to you, Doctor.
Look, I'm happy to kick off by saying that, look, I think we have a real challenge in the system. There's no doubt that we have not comprehensively discussed the possibility of how do we resolve the issue of financing higher education. We do know that we don't want higher education simply be for rich, for the children of rich people. That we do want poor people to also have access to the best universities, because that will enable the transformation of the society. And government has tried to put money into it. To be fair, they've quadrupled the budget over the last 4 years, from 2.5 billion to about 9.5 billion for support. But frankly, demand outstrips supply. We just do not, the money just does not go far enough. So let me give you an example. We've had 179 million for NSFAS funds, which will cover about 2,800 students at WITS University, 10%. But the problem is, I've still got many more students looking for resources. And I think what this means is we need a really serious conversation. The politicians need to stop politicking about it. We need a very serious conversation about how we finance this. We need to bring business together, the universities, the government, and all of them.
We've been saying that for many years, Prof.
That's right.
And Dr. Parker, with everything that we know, why is it that the situation is not getting better?
Well, I think the situation has gotten better. As Prof has indicated, we've quadrupled the funding over the last 4 years to NSFAS. And this means that we have been working very hard at increasing the funding. But as we know, it's still not sufficient funding to cover every single needy student out there. And I think the biggest issue for us is that we've got many poor students looking to access higher education, and many students who are in that particular level where they can't get the funding from NSFAS and they can't get funding from other sources. We call those students the missing middle, the students whose parents are too wealthy for them to access
I was one of those students. It was hard, I can testify.
And too poor for them to actually be supported by their parents or to access the kind of commercial loans that are out there. So I think the idea of us moving this conversation into one where we are looking at government on its own being not the only one that provides the funding. Because up until now, it's always been looking to the vote to get this funding, and we need to get other bodies on board.
Why have we not done that to date? Because this is not a new conversation. Like I said, every year it's the same conversation.
Absolutely.
By now, business should be on board. Universities should have plans of how they're going to deal with this, and government should be increasing as they're doing.
So let me give you a real example of that, right? So let's say you're earning 500,000 rand a year, a middle-class person. You've got 2 kids at WITS University. If you're doing an engineering degree or a medical degree, plus accommodation will cost you over 100,000. If you've got 2 kids, that's 200,000. That's half of your entire salary. It's not manageable. And therefore, there has to be some kind of comprehensive way of addressing it. And all role players are going to have to come to the party on it. And we have to be serious about this. So I'll tell you where I get angry at politicians. Politicians go around talking about free education. We know we're not going to free education in this country. Why lie? Because when you say things like that, you create a rising tide of expectations, and then people are very angry. I speak to students.
Prof, the question I was asking earlier is relating to the kids that are coming out of the schooling system. They've got their, what are they calling it now? The exemption, National Senior Certificate and all of that. But they are not getting through to the universities. Now, we had President Jacob Zuma in his January 8th statement saying that universities are putting their costs up too high.
Well, let me explain that. So he says we're putting up our costs up too high. Frankly, the government subsidy has been declining in real terms. There was a study done by the Department of Higher Education and Training under Cyril Ramaphosa. What it shows is if you use the global average, we should be funded at 37 billion. At the moment, the subsidy is 22 billion. We're underfunding higher education by something like 40 to 50%. Then we ask, how do you cover the costs? Last year, the rand to the dollar fell by 22%. The net effect of that is every research infrastructure, research equipment, and all library books went up by 22%. How do we close the costs? The only way to do it is to increase student fees. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to destroy the quality of places like WITS University and many other universities, and we're going to have the same thing that we got in the secondary education system. You create access, but you create a shoddy education system. And that's what we don't want to do. We want access for poor people, but we want to make sure that poor people get a good quality education. And that means we have to spend on higher education.
Do you buy that argument, Doctor?
Look, I think that ever since the white paper, the first white paper 3, we understood that higher education is something that provides access to the economic goods of society. When somebody goes into higher education and they succeed in higher education, they get access into the economy in ways that they never had before. And that means that they become a productive part of the economy. And I think that's a very important aspect of higher education. And understanding that, one recognizes that we can't think about higher education access as being something that individual students don't also contribute to. So we do have a cost-sharing model in higher education. That has been in the system right from the very beginning. And that's also why we understood that poor students need help, because the majority of students in higher education at that time were the more privileged. And so the idea of NSFAS came out of that. PROF has indicated that we support the institutions by about 23 billion. That's the basic subsidies that we provide. But then when you add NSFAS onto that, we're talking about the total amount going into higher education, just from the DHET, to be about 28 billion. Now, if you add to that other government aspects.
Dr. Parker, unfortunately, we're going to have to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to pick up on this issue, particularly of the university's role in curbing this tide of a lack of funding for poor students at universities. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do drop us a line on our Facebook page or on our Twitter pages. Stay with us. So we're in conversation tonight on Interface with the Deputy DG of Higher Education, Dr. Di Parker, and Professor Adam HABIB, who is the Vice-Chancellor of WITS University. And we're talking about student funding. And we do welcome your thoughts. Do keep them coming. We'll take some of your Facebook and Twitter messages a little later. But Dr. Parker, I just want to pick up on a point that Prof made earlier, that as universities, they don't want to drop costs and drop quality as a result. Is it necessarily like that, that if they were to do more to try and cut down on their costs, the quality of the education they provide would suffer?
I think from the department's point of view, we do believe that we have to find better efficiencies in the system. But there's no doubt that institutions require significant funding. Higher education is not a cheap business. Equipment is expensive. A lot of it comes from overseas. And we have to maintain that if we want to actually use our higher education system to really make a difference in terms of our economic development.
But are they doing enough as universities or higher education institutions to drop the cost as much as they can so that they can accommodate, or at least be part of the solution in accommodating the poor students?
I think universities every year have to look at their budgets, and they have to understand how they balance their budgets. If you understand that the subsidies that government provides through the vote make approximately 40% of the total costs of the university system, that means that there's a 60% that still has to be found from other sources. Now, universities will be going out finding funds from donors and from various sources, but obviously a large amount of that, possibly about half of that 60%, has to come from student fees. And as I said before, that's about students and families also contributing towards the cost of higher education, which has both public and private benefits. It's not just something that is for the public good, it's also for the private benefits of the individual, which is why higher education is set up as a cost-sharing institution.
So, Prof, just on this issue of what universities are charging, Dr. Bladen Zamande, the Minister of Education, said higher education inflation is often higher than the inflation of the country. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, our cost structures are completely determined in dollar terms and not in rand terms. So you don't buy equipment in South Africa. You don't buy library books in South Africa. You buy them from overseas, and that's priced in dollars. And if you have a big shift, as I said to you in the last year and a half, on the dollar-rand exchange, you're now paying way above the inflation rate. That's the first big thing. The second thing is, actually, at a place like WITS, we do large amount of bursaries to students, independent of the department. So we actually, what in effect we do, is we charge much higher. We take the money from the where we've been able to raise income and transfer that to poor students and fund poor students. So we spend over 100 million rand a year on new income that we put towards bursaries for students independently. We raise an enormous amount of money. I do think that one has to, I said this a couple of weeks ago, and I think I said it, I am prepared to take WITS' university's books and put it on the table. Bring the best economists in the country and tell me if you can do a better job in not reducing quality,
but reducing costs.
But reducing costs. We've looked at this every single way. The problem is, as Di said, higher education is a very expensive business. And if we want to be the inclusive economy and the inclusive democracy we want to be in the future, then we're going to have to underwrite that cost, whether we like it or not. Of course, on a shared model. And I think that that's something that we need to think through.
So these allegations by the Student Representative Council that money is being mismanaged and all of that, you dismiss that?
Look, I'm almost certain there's individual cases of mismanagement.
Yeah.
I'm almost certain that there are administrative efficiencies that need to happen, and we're working on that. We are far more efficient today in the NSFAS system and in the universities than we were 3 years ago. And I think we can improve. I've already begun to look at our administrative processes and said, I want more enhancements next year so that we improve. I'm not saying that there aren't lessons to be learned. But is there any way that students are being prejudiced by the fact that we're not distributing the kinds of money? I don't think that that's true.
In fact, the allegation is that you are anti-black and anti-poor.
So let me understand this. I love this description.
Yeah.
WITS University being anti-black. 75% of our students are black. WITS anti-poor. WITS University, from all of the top universities, has the highest number of poor students. We have 20% of seats in medical school reserved for quintile 1 and 2. We have 20% of seats reserved for rural students. What student leaders have got to learn is something that higher education was meant to teach them, is you can't make allegations without evidence. And that's what I'd like the student leaders to start talking about, is provide evidence for the things when they make allegations like this.
Dr. Parker, Professor HABIB has been quoted as saying that, and you can bear us out on this one, Prof, South Africa's expenditure on the tertiary sector as a proportion of GDP is below the average for developing countries. You've said this.
Yes.
But isn't that to be expected, bearing in mind our history as a country?
Look, I think that one of the things that we have to understand about funding of education is we have quite a high proportion of our GDP spent on education as a whole. But the lion's share of that goes to basic education and to younger children, and I think increasingly is going to go to that as we try to roll out grade R for the majority of students out there. So higher education itself gets a much lower proportion of funding than really it ought to. In terms of the OECD countries, it's probably towards I think it's the second last country on the scale, and in fact, on average, even lower than the average in Africa.
So why are we not doing more to give it, the kind of
I think
funding
that every year we do approach Parliament to get further funding for higher education. I think there's been a lot of effort being put into that. But as you know, we have to have balance out the issues that we need in this country. And if we look at the amount of funding out there, we've got to deal with all the various things.
So it's a matter of prioritizing.
It's a matter of the prioritizing of this. Okay. But I do think the other thing that's really important to understand in terms of the issues that Prof was talking about just now, and Adam, you were really focusing on WITS.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at the system as a whole, we've got to understand that we've recognized that there could be quite a lot of inefficiencies in the system, and we've also recognized that there could be some fraudulent activity, particularly around the NSFAS. And for that reason, the department and the minister are putting together a forensic audit at the moment, where we'll be looking into this issue, particularly of students who are accessing funding when they ought not to be, because we need to use that funding for the poorest of students.
Prof, I know you would like to add on to that point, but we have to take another short break.
Sure.
We're back after this. And we're now wrapping up our discussion on student funding, and we are taking your thoughts on our social media pages. Phil Mack says, government has the ability to bail out Eskom and SAA. I think it should also do the same with NSFAS, and that those leaders in waiting can complete their studies. Matume Siketa says, I'm from a family that depends on social grants, and I have passed my matric, but I cannot go to varsity because of poverty. And Mzwandi Levena says, I've applied so many times before and after matric, yet no luck. They focus on students who did science in some cases, but it's not fair on the rest of us. And on the social media comments go. But just on the part of NSFAS, so before we go to that, you had a point to make before the break.
So I was just saying, I mean, Di is a bit polite. She's a government official, so she's got to be more careful. I have to be less careful. I do think that government needs to take higher education seriously. I worry sometimes that in many departments, not higher education necessarily, but in many other departments at the heart of the state, they don't take universities seriously enough. They're going to have to recognize, because they don't put the kinds of money in it, they often have very simplistic attitudes towards universities. They talk about without understanding the complexity of building a university. And I do think that there needs to be a recognition that if we want to be free and we want to be economic developed, then the universities are central to that project. And frankly, having 0.75% of the GDP spent on higher education is way too low to be a free society.
You would agree, right?
Well, the issue of the amount of funding going to higher education, absolutely. We have to look at it as investment. An investment in the youth, particularly, is investment in our future.
But Prof, are you being fair on government on this one, bearing in mind that, like you said earlier, supply is far less than the demand that's there. And also bearing in mind our history as a country. The apartheid system did mess us up to the point where we have a lot of people coming into the education system now that we cannot cater for.
That's right. But that doesn't mean that we can't make hard choices. We waste 30 billion rand a year on corruption. It's not my figure. It's Treasury's. 30 billion rand. If you save that 30 billion rand, you'd resolve higher education's problems. That's all you require. So some courage at the heart of the state to make hard choices. Yes, apartheid messed us up, but we're going to have to heal that divide. We have to overcome that history. And that means hard choices. It means that if you can put the kinds of money that you put in the World Cup, if you can put the kinds of money that you put in the arms deal, why the hell can't we put that kind of money in higher education itself? That's the challenge that confronts our political leadership.
Now, would this be part of the solution? Historically disadvantaged institutions have got a development grant that was announced recently, and they're getting about 410 million rand per annum. That goes to about 2.5 billion rand from 2015 until 2022. Is that the solution to try and get more students to go to those universities rather than your WITS universities and the like?
I don't think that's the intention of the development grant. The intention of the development grant is to assist those institutions to look at their fundamental challenges and to find solutions to those fundamental challenges so that we can create a more equitable higher education system where all our students going to any university are going to get a really high quality undergraduate education, and whatever qualification they do will be of high quality. So the intention of that grant is for those institutions who are sitting in a situation where they still haven't dealt with the backlogs of apartheid, for them to be able to identify what the critical challenges are in order to deal with it. This isn't about additional funding to fund students. It's about getting systems in place to make those more efficient and effective institutions.
And very quickly, NSFAS, what's going on there? We hear that there's allegations of mismanagement and fraud and all sorts of things. Is that the problem?
I don't think it's NSFAS itself as an institution. NSFAS itself as an institution has been strengthening its processes and the way in which it works. The issues of fraud are really multifaceted. We've got the situation, for example, among students who fraudulently try to access funding, which is meant for poor students. So we'll have allegations of middle-class students who end up making affidavits about their parents being deceased and getting some gogo somewhere to stand in as their grandmother.
And how do you police that? It's been happening for years, Dr. Parker.
This has been happening, and this is the whole reason for us doing this forensic audit now. We're going to be looking at an in-depth forensic audit. The Minister has indicated as part of that we want a whistleblowing process.
But post that, how do you police it? What do you do with them? And how do you find these people?
I'll tell you how you do it. Yeah. The first group of people you catch, you throw them in jail.
Okay.
You throw them in jail. You can't deal with corruption in our society unless people realize there are consequences for corruption. You bar the students, you take the officials that are implicated, whether they're in university or in the systems, and you throw them in jail. And I promise you, you do this 1 year, and you do this the second year, and you don't give them parole, you'll see how quickly the system comes in line. That's the historic challenge of South Africa. Do we have the courage to make the hard choices that are required?
But perhaps I could just add to that. I mean, that's one way, and I don't disagree with the idea that we need to do that, and we have indicated that this needs to happen, prosecution needs to happen where fraud is found. But the other issue is the development of NSFAS Central Application System, because quite frankly, it's through that which would be linked to the SARS, to the UIF, to the social development and so on, that will be the thing that in the long run enables us to have much more efficient systems and to deal with the problem.
We have run out of time. There's so much more we should be talking about on this one, but I hope that at least we deal with some of the burning issues that are confronting higher education. But thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
It's a pleasure.
We leave it there for tonight. Thank you so much for your time. Do join us again next week at the same time.